started, I just want to start by introducing our guest today, Tierney Brosius, who is an associate biology professor at Augustana College in Rock Island, Illinois. And Tierney believes that art can be a way to communicate science, facilitate observational skills, and change people's perspective on insects specifically. So she brings her art into her research, her classroom, free time through illustration, collaborative museum shows, classroom drawing activities, arthropod embroidery, entomology themed clothing and accessories, and so much more. And so she has this background in illustration as well as in fashion, which is why I've invited her here today. So I saw her first on social media actually as Dr. Beetle, where you can find her posting basically her illustrations, her lino cuts, her knitting projects and embroideries, but also just all of her ento fashion like she is wearing today, I see. And yeah, and so today she agreed to be here to kind of expand her scope into just science fashion. And yeah, without further ado, please take it away and thank you.
Yeah, no problem. This is exciting. And it was a really fun talk to get put together. I often find that these sorts of opportunities lend themselves to more ideas. And I came across a couple of new projects that I wasn't aware of as I was getting this talk together, just because my goal was to kind of have just a general conversation of why I think fashion and textile art in general have something interesting to bring to the table as far as, science communication. And at the same time, I wanted to maybe give all of you some takeaways little ideas that you can incorporate into your own wardrobe. And it's not like you have to have been like knitting for 20 years like I have, right? Like I do some crazy knitting, but it's only because I've been doing it forever. But I think there's little ways that are very approachable that anybody can do. And even tonight you could run out and get yourself some, fabric markers, and tomorrow you could have like a equation for some sort of ecological model that you've put together, just bordering the line of your shirt, and as I'll talk about too, I think that also allows people to be like, hey, what's that? And then right away, you've got an N, right? You can kind of nerd out and talk about your science just because someone was curious about your clothes. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Let's see. So let me know, because sometimes when I do this, oh, yeah, it switched around. Hang on a second. I think I want to sharing the wrong screen now. Hang on. I'm going to stop the share. Try it again. There, are you seeing the right one now?
Yeah, looks all good.
Okay, I just need to move you guys, I think. There. All right, so I also had to give a nod to Miss Frizzle because I think a lot of us that's one of the first people we think of when we think about wearing your science. And I'll admit there is a hashtag that's Frizzlecore on Instagram that I do post to. So let's see, come on slides, work for me tonight. There we go. Jess gave a good background on, who I am and what I do, but I've kind of been interested in this art and science merger for a long time. I started out my degree at the University of Nebraska. I do work with tiger beetles and some extremophile stuff, which is really fun. But lately I've been at a small liberal arts college and all of my students are undergraduates, so I do not have any graduate students here. But of course, this is kind of the theme of what you're all doing, is talking about science communication. And, the idea that we know it's important, we know that we're often not great at it, and we know that we need to get better. And scientists have been spending a lot of time talking about how, to do that. And part of that is coming up with these cool, novel ways to do science communication. Some of that, I don't know if you've talked about it all, is like the dance your PhD phenomenon, which is really exciting. Just let that. And then I know I've already talked to Barrett. I actually got some pictures from him for part of today's talk, because Barrett is also a intomo fashion sort of person. So he also does some of his own creations. But part of that is talking about using art as a communication tool for science. And one thing that I'm going to mention an artist today who's really taken her textile art in an interesting direction, which is actually these artist in residence programs. And I would say that if any of you are ever in a position at some point, you're part of a lab or you're part of a research team, I think advocating for artists to bring artists into your spaces, into your labs, and then letting them kind of translate what's going on through different mediums of art is an excellent idea. And I've seen a lot of interesting examples for how people are doing this, and these are growing throughout the world. So this person I was talking about, this Lindsay Olson, I met her a few years ago. She's not too far from where I'm at. She came to my college for a presentation, and I totally, ate up everything she was putting out there. But she has worked as part of a artist in residence at this one is one where they were looking at I think it was like deep sea acoustic sort of science. But my favorite one that she worked with too is actually doing like wastewater treatment facility. So she was actually doing all of these like middle microbes that like eat poop and kind of gross things. But at the same time, she was bringing it to a level of artistry and beauty and really talking about the natural processes and how much we need this technology. It's the science that goes on right inside of our community that allows us to live in large communities without getting sick. So it's a huge, huge level of importance. But in a podcast that she gave, I was listening, and she kept saying things like textiles lure people in and make them feel welcome. And there's something very tactile about textile art, which of course, if you're a fine artist like Lindsay, it's hard not to go up and run up and touch a piece of textile art. When I had a piece in the last Entomological Society of America meeting, and it was funny to watch how many people actually would just kind of go up, accidentally touch my piece, and then they would quickly pull their hand away because they were like horrified at what they realized that they had just done. But I think that's the nature of textile art, is it really does invite the audience in to interact with it by its nature. No, I didn't run up and yell at anybody during that. I just thought it was funny. So. But one thing to think about is textile art is a very old form of art. And generally, it's just the process of using fiber from different animals. So of course, sheep, silk has a really long, cool, and interesting production, flax, cotton, polyester. Recently, in the last 100 years, we're starting to get some of these more synthetic pieces. But one thing is, if you kind of look up what's the difference between something that's considered to be a textile art versus a fine art, or even what's a fine art versus a craft, a lot of times this idea is that fine art is used for beauty and aesthetic purposes only. It's only for decoration, where textile art often is not considered to be fine art because it has practical applications and you use it. However, that doesn't sound like a really good distinction between something that's elevated to a fine art status versus textile. And a lot of people have been revisiting these ideas because they're really outdated. Textile art is got associations with domesticity and femininity. So they've often been blocked out of the fine art category through just, hey, this isn't where women belong. And a lot of times they were creating pieces of art that just were being excluded early on. And, producing fine art also came from a place of privilege. The people who were producing fine art were often in a wealthier social class, and others were excluded. But it wasn't that they didn't have that creative nature. And oftentimes the outlet for that creativity was through practical fiber art sort of thing. So a lot of early art that's produced with textiles, I would say, is at the elevation of fine art. But remember, these were often people who were from more of a lower working class background. And of course, I'm not going to list all of these, but there's a lot of different examples of textile art. It's, super common. I mean, I'll admit I've partaken from way too many of these, and I'm actually going to show you in the last 24 hours. I was like, I want to try this. And I'm like, trying a new type of textile art. There's a few of these I'll never try. I don't know. I can't imagine trying to make lace. That's a whole nother level of keeping track of where your fibers are. I don't think I could do that one. But of course, I'm going to give you some examples of insects and all of these. I've got some quilting here, embroidery, cross stitching. This is a nice one because this is very like, if you get cross stitching is probably one of the more approachable forms of embroidery, just because it's a pretty, if you can follow a grid, you can cross stitch. Weaving. The one piece by this Rowan Shusheim Anderson is actually a art professor here at Augustana College. I got to sit in on one of her textile art classes last spring, which was pretty fantastic. I've taken 2 art classes from faculty at Augustana since I've been here. Technically, I failed both classes because I could not keep up with the workload, and I've only turned in about half the assignments. But it's been a really wonderful thing to be able to kind of reach across campus and partake in being a student yet again, alongside of some of my students. Basket weaving. So why textiles to communicate science? And my kids, I've got 2 kind of junior high age children, and they both think I'm like the lamest person ever, because right now I'm reading a book on the history of fiber, and they're both like, that sounds like the worst thing ever. But it's really fascinating. And one thing that you realize right away is that this idea that textiles are the backbone of human civilization, and really it's a technology that's become so ingrained with our daily lives that we don't even see it anymore. You know, everything we wear, most of the things we use have some sort of fiber in it. And if they look at this book goes through the process of like really a lot of early math. They think that, you know, prime numbers and the study of those were actually connected with the technology of weaving looms, and computer programming first came from a lot of that weaving technology. Chemistry emerged from the drive that humans had for some of those synthetic dye colors. So again and again, you actually see where science and textiles have been interwoven, pardon the pun. Another one too was understanding like where disease theory came from. And some of that was actually trying to figure out why the silk moths kept dying and learning sterile techniques to keep them from getting infected with bacteria or fungal infections. So there's a ton of examples in this book that really connect to this. So it's interesting that they've got this long-term connection. So why not use that as part of exploring science and textiles? So science is often not approachables, but textiles specifically call us to touch them. And I really love the connection. So just a few examples, you know, there's a lot of artists out there I've been kind of following on Instagram. You know, this Ellen Thomas does these really amazing little microbial plates using techniques of crochet and felting. Anne Honeyman has done like these really interesting textiles and tapestries. This one here, I was just teaching last week in my introductory biology class, talking about speciation and the evolution of the peppered moth, which I think is in every intro textbook that was ever written. Here's some pollen details, kind of looking at the diversity in different types of pollen. So, you know, science and textiles and Miss Frizzle, you know, is why I started to wear my science and what I think that has done for me personally. And I've always liked that, you know, it's time to take chances and make mistakes and get messy. And I think with some of what I'm going to show you, I actually encourage you to, you know, try out some of these techniques and honestly go to Goodwill and buy yourself a $3 shirt. And if you mess it up, you mess it up. If not, you have something really interesting to kind of walk away with. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples that I found in the last few days. Hopefully the sound on this one comes through. These are some examples of specifically using textiles to talk about ideas in science. And I thought this one was particularly fascinating.
Make, Do and Mend is a project developed by Anna Dimitriou in collaboration with Dr. Sarah Goldberg and Dr. Roy Amit at the Synthetic Biology Laboratory for the Decipherment of Genetic Code at the Technion in Israel as part of the European Union Future Emerging Technology Project, MRG grant. The project references the 75th anniversary of the first use of penicillin in a human patient in 1941 and takes the form of an altered antique wartime women's suit marked with the British Board of Trade's utility logo, CC41, which stands for Controlled Commodity 1941. meaning that the use of materials has been deemed to meet the government's austerity regulation. The holes and stains in the suit have been patched and embroidered with silk patterned with E. coli bacteria grown using a dye-containing growth medium, forming pigmented colonies or spots. The genomes of these E. coli bacteria have been edited using a revolutionary gene editing technique called CRISPR to remove an ampicillin antibiotic resistance gene and repair it using a technique called homologous recombination. Scarlessly patch the break with a fragment of DNA encoding the World War II slogan, "Make do and mend," which was converted into ASCII code and then into base 4. The slogan encouraged housewives to repair their clothes during the wartime rationing period. Ampicillin is part of the penicillin group of beta-lactam antibiotics. So in a way, it's conceptually and poetically true to say that with this artistic genomic edit, Demetriou and Goldberg have used today's latest technology to mend the organism back to its pre-1941, pre-antibiotic era state. We now face a serious global problem of antibiotic resistance as disease-causing bacteria evolve mechanisms to resist our attempts to destroy them, and the wonder drugs such as penicillin no longer work. This is in some part because we have misused the drugs we had since we kick-started the arms race of the antibiotic age in 1941. Our antibiotic stocks have not been protected as the controlled commodities they should have been. But as a counterpoint, today's governments now seek to control the use of CRISPR. But this is very difficult because of its accessibility and its potential to revolutionize biotechnology.
So this was one that I thought was interesting in terms of talking about microbes, which are so small, and talking about the introduction of new biotechnologies. Then this particular series, I wish I had pictures of all of them, but this Helen and Kate story are a sister duo. One is a developmental biologist, the other one is an artist, and they partnered up to actually make 26 dresses that represent the first 1,000 hours of development. So gastralization, here we have the heart tube, the development of the lungs, but a lot of these different stages, and it's really meant to be a way for people to kind of engage with early development of humans, understand developmental biology in a new and an unexpected way. But what I thought was really interesting reading about some of their work, they were quoted as talking about the power of fashion to drive science and use it as one reason why scientists become interested in working in fashion, while artists have turned to science for the richness of subject matter as well as for new reproductive tools made available by evolving technologies. So kind of acknowledging those interconnectedness of fashion and science. And then interestingly, this particular paper exploring women's dress looked at the asymmetrical power relations inherent in art and science based on gender. And this gets a bit back to this idea that really early on, textile art was seen as a more feminine and domestic practice. So they're really using this idea of bringing the domain of science in relation to the domain of the feminine. And since science was also very exclusive early on, those two things kind of merged together to have interesting conversations around science and including more groups in today's environment. So a lot of interesting things happening there. So I'm not to that point yet, but I'm kind of hoping, I mean, right now I'm much more a Miss Frizzle than I am kind of a fine scale artist, but maybe someday, right? I'm already starting to think about, instead of just wearing insects, like what other conversations can I have with some of my art? So the next few projects that I have planned, I'm planning to maybe incorporate either talking about some of my data or having larger conversations, about maybe the insect extinction crisis and those sorts of ideas. So that's where I really want to head. For now, I'm just kind of talk you through some of what I do. And I think that the idea of celebrating our science and our passions by wearing it and making it is a really interesting direction for some of us to go if we're really passionate about science communication. So this is kind of a pile of things, but I'm going to walk through some of the things that I have. So, you know, full disclosure, I really started by buying a lot of my clothes early on. And of course, you know, I would just find things and be really lucky. I started when I was in graduate school when I had no money. So oftentimes it was scrounging a little bit. But as I was, you know, looking for things to buy, oftentimes just out of sheer, like, I cannot afford it, I then began to make things. And I started out as, you know, a first generation college student, grew up in a family that did a lot of mending and making just out of sheer necessity. So it's kind of fun to celebrate that skill set that, you know, I learned from my grandmother as a child, as I've kind of moved on to making things. But I would say if you're looking for like places, where can I buy really cool insect clothing? I would say if you're on a budget, eBay and Poshmark are the very best. I've gotten some of my best stuff from those two locations because a lot of times the best stuff I certainly couldn't afford when it was brand new. This Vestitere is new to me and I've only purchased one thing off of it. Most of the stuff, even at the discount rate, are still too expensive for me because it's like Gucci and things like that. But that's a pretty interesting place to look around for insect things. And then of course, Etsy, hands down, you can buy from people who are, you know, making things all over the country. And there are some amazing and creative people out there that you can definitely support by wearing science stuff. I love it. I feel like we're in the age of the nerd. More people right now are buying and selling science themed things than ever. So it's a good time to really wear your science. But I'm going to start, you know, I'm going to talk a little bit about making your own stuff. These are a couple of just like not really failed projects, but projects that haven't gotten anywhere. I started working on a pair of like embroidered suspenders, and this was from the textile art class that I took a while ago. But some of the ideas here. So embroidery, I'm going to show you some, these are some of the projects that I've worked on the last few years. I'm planning on maybe expanding this. This jacket I have, eventually the plan was to put all the Saturnid moths from North America on the jacket. I started it 5 years ago and it still just has one moth on it, but I still wear it anyway because I think it's cool. And these little beetles have been a lot of fun as well. Other scientists are out there doing embroidery. Ellen Hickman worked on her PhD, is also a scientific illustrator, and she was working on the anatomy and genomics of her subject species. And of course, she did a scientific illustration and embroidery piece celebrating the plants that she had been working on. Emily Keeble is a paleontologist. I found her on Instagram, and she also once in a while will sell her pieces as well, but you can actually see the little blue marks. She doesn't just like hand do this out of her brain. She actually sits there and first she draws with a washable marker, and then she just does a simple embroidery stitch to kind of bring her fossils to life. Or I guess this one here, this the vertebrae on the back, she was teaching a vertebrate anatomy class. This is Tessa Perlow. She is also on Instagram and does a lot of really beautiful botanical illustrations out of embroidery. But what I want to do is I think I've got all these muted, but I just wanted to show you how simple some of this is. This is a pretty crude beginning like embroidery, but it's as simple as just doing a running stitch to do simple outlines. And this is just cotton fiber. And I think I like this one because it's, as well as it's not necessarily finely done, it shows you kind of how simple it is just to put a few stitches on something. And here even, I haven't tried this yet. I'm really eager to try embroidering on a pair of like Converse shoes to, I don't know, of course I would do something entomology themed, but this one here, they're doing something botanical. I noticed they have a glove on because I'm sure it's really difficult to pull that needle through the canvas of the shoe. But anyway, it takes some time and practice. And the nice thing is it's pretty easy to rip it out if it's not going the direction you want it to. This cotton embroidery fiber is completely washable. Well, I mean, it'd be something you'd want to gentle wash and maybe not just throw in the dryer, but hang. Most of the stuff is definitely washable. And then I think, didn't want to do this whole thing. I thought I had a little, yeah. And I encourage you just to go on, I try to give credit to most of these videos, but there are, any stitch you can imagine is out on YouTube. The project I was working on last night, it was because I found a really clear YouTube video and I was like, this, you know, I'm all for this. And so I kind of just copied what they were doing and ended up with pretty good results. So anyway, this is just kind of showing you that there's all sorts of little stitches you can do with embroidery to get a lot of different textures and interesting effects. One of my favorite that I've picked up in the last couple of years is lino cut. And lino cutting is essentially just making a stamp that you can use over and over again to stamp whatever image you want onto fabric. So here I, stamped the trilobites and also the tiger beetles on the back of that jacket. And I'm going to show a quick video on how you do this, but really all you're doing is using a knife to carve out some sort of piece of plastic that you then roll textile ink on and then just stamp it. And I know that just makes it sound really simple, but also you can buy like super expensive knives, but this is just this cheap Dick Blick set. And I mean, I think I paid less than $10 for the roller and the knives, and you can just buy new blades that you can, just kind of throw away as you go along. So you don't need to buy the really expensive, like Swiss wooden handled ones. And so this is a bit of lino cut plus embroidery. So I have a jacket that I've, it's called mirror embroidery. It's an Indian technique, but you can also use it to do these beetle elytra, which is a really old technique for embroidery. The beetle shells, beetle elytras, people have been using as kind of the early version of a sequin for a long time in many cultures around the world. But then of course, on top of it, I lino cut the patterning that I had on and on the jacket as well. So this makes it look really easy, but I think they've got there's different softnesses of the plastic, and this one looks like a pretty soft plastic. So it's not nearly as difficult to cut as I think the one I'm using is. It was just the first one I ever used, so I've kind of been sticking with it, but I haven't tried this pink lino cut material. But anyway, she just transfers the pattern, and I'm going to kind of skip through here because you can see how you essentially just outline the piece and you get rid of anything that you don't want to show up in your final production. So you can kind of see she just slowly carves away at it, gets all the little details. And then you kind of move up. You start with a really fine grain. There's like different sizes of these knives on here. And you just can move to a thicker and thicker blade to kind of take out more and more of the material. And then eventually you can just move on to a scissors, cut away what you don't want. You kind of just roll it until you get a real kind of tacky, thin layer. She has a special tool. I just use the bottom of a ball jar and push down when I'm doing my version. She ends up covering, the outside of a bag. And then another thing that you can do is just using fabric paint. You can straight up just paint on top of fabric, use markers. I reached out to this woman, and she was using just a regular, she bought the fabric with the floral design on it, and then she painted directly on it to add the beetles. So, I mean, there's a lot of different ways you can do this. One way,
Be like front and center if you don't love what you did.
she just found a blazer at like Salvation Army, and she's almost just, I mean, she's just straight up watercoloring with fabric dyes. This one would make me a little bit nervous because I think you can make a big mess in a hurry, but the effect that she's able to get is absolutely gorgeous because she's just kind of putting light washes of the pigment onto the fabric. So I feel like you could have a lot of fun with this. And sometimes I think as scientists, we get so caught up with representation being perfectly accurate, where I think even sometimes a hand-drawn look or a handcrafted look has an additional charm to it that people tend to really like. And then another way to do things is to make is to make stencils, and they kind of make it very simple looking here, but kind of like the lino cut, you figure out what you want for your pattern. You can cut it out. And then simply just take textile paint and gently push it into the stencil. And then kind of the reveal. And I've seen some really good insect pieces with this. I've actually heard from some people that they prefer this over the lino cut because the lino cut sometimes hard to get little details like antenna, where stenciling you can get a little more fine detail. And then of course, we have Barrett's beautiful stenciling. Most of the, I think, ant clothes that he wears actually is made from stenciling. And the nice thing about this, just like the lino cut, is once you have a really good stencil, you can reuse it over and over again. And I wanted to also, I haven't tried some of these fabric markers, but I was following this particular person on Instagram and noted that she gets some really nice, almost scientific illustration level detail using some of these fabric markers. So I would really highly recommend giving these a try. And that's what I was thinking. Even if you're not very good at drawing, I think just putting on like text of like some of the equations you're using for some of your research or something like that would be kind of fun just to have, although you're probably tired of looking at them all day after you've been staring at a computer screen trying to get your analysis to work. I understand. But I think they could be good conversation starters. And then the thing that I really like doing is knitting, and I'm starting to take this kind of to a crazy level of detail, but early on I used other people's kind of knitting patterns. But I've taken that to, this is the piece that I had in the show at the Entomological Society of America, where you can see where I took other people's charts from this previous slide, the fly and the beetle, and I used it and incorporated it into this design. The only like insect on this that is my original are the ants, because I figured if I was doing a E.O. Wilson quote, I had to have ants somewhere on the piece. And this is the first one where I was really starting to think about interpreting, having some sort of interpretive element. So what I decided was I would include Lepidoptera, Diptera, Coleoptera, and Hymenoptera, because those are the 4 largest insect orders. So I was actually putting some thought into having something be translational in terms of having some sort of element to the education behind it. I was also thinking about how insects are a good metaphor. I mean, knitting the stitches within this are a good metaphor for the role that insects play in our ecosystems, because they really are the little links that kind of pull everything together. And when, just like with this sweater, if I were to take and start cutting single stitches, you'd have runs just like you would in a sweater, right? Where the whole thing would start to unravel. And the more you cut, the quicker it would unravel. Just like if species were to go extinct, you see the ecosystem begin to unravel. So I think this is where I started to really begin to think about symbolism and metaphor within a garment, which has been a lot of fun. And then this piece was the next sweater, or my original plan was to actually incorporate this quote from Darwin into the insect one, but then I was like, well, And I actually ended up incorporating all of the diversity that I teach in our introductory biology lab. In one of the introductory biology sequence that's a full year, we teach the organisms to ecosystems portion. So I've got every major phyla that we cover in that class represented at some level on this particular sweater. And then I find partners in crime, and I'm looking on Instagram, and this guy, I actually reached out to him and chatted with him a little bit about what he's done, but he is a paleontologist that happens to study turtles. And not only did he incorporate the whole phylogenetic tree, it's actually calibrated by time. So every row of stitches is so many million years. So it's all completely done at a certain level of accuracy that I was just astonished by. So he really raised the bar in terms of incorporating data into a sweater. And I think what I really love about this too is, like I said, a lot of early textile weaving was based on math, and then to have him kind of incorporating math into this knitting is just, I think, absolutely phenomenal. And if you were kind of interested, and if any of you are knitters, or you're interested in how this works, it really is just a grid system, like cross stitching and other things when it comes to knitting. And I will admit, if you're taking up knitting, it can be really frustrating at first, because I think it's a lot of muscle memory. But once you have that, you get that by just knitting. I always tell people, go out and buy some beautiful yarn that no matter how much you mess up the stitches, it'll still be beautiful. And knit yourself 3 or 4 really lumpy scarves. And that's how you kind of learn the tension and all of that. And then you can move to the more complicated stuff. But this other knitting artist online shared with me that she just uses the printouts from this printablepaper.net. And you'll notice if you look at this sheet, the knitting stitches are not quite square. They're actually a bit rectangular, so they're a bit wider than they are tall. So this takes that into account as you're drawing out your knitting pattern. Otherwise, things get really distorted if you use regular graph paper. But that's just my suggestion if there's any knitters out there. But if some of you are like, I don't knit, I won't be picking up knitting anytime soon, I think that this particular advice here is you can just actually take a sweater that you pick up from Goodwill, and you can just embroider a motif right over top of it. So she's just kind of, let's see where she is. She's just going to take some yarn. And if you think about it, that knitting gives you kind of a grid that you can count stitches and make things somewhat equal. And you can just embroider right into a sweater that's pre-existing. And get some really beautiful results from that sort of thing. And she's just tying knots on the other side. Doesn't have to be beautiful on both sides. And then she kind of shows how she does the vines. And I was getting some ads from the store Anthropology. And I swear it was funny because a lot of the pieces they had for the winter season was just somebody had taken and embroidered right over top of the sweater. Another thing that they'll do, there's a huge trend out that's called visible mending. And I do some of that. I've got a sweater that's unraveling in multiple places. And as I add, and as it gets more holes, I just keep adding really pretty little patches to it. So, if you have something that's falling apart, it could be an opportunity to add maybe your research organism embroidered on top, or buy a patch. Maybe you just can buy a patch that somebody has made. There's a ton of different patches on Etsy where other people have made things. So you can get pretty creative with it. And just as an example, I found these images. Somebody knit this scarf and then embroidered over it. But again, you could buy a scarf, or you could, buy a sweater. And here we've got, mitosis on a, just kind of embroidered right over top. So something as simple as that, that would definitely start a conversation. Another thing, I think it's funny because you can identify another scientist out in the wild. When someone's got this on, they're committed to being a scientist. And then, I highly recommend to adorn yourself in science. People will look at you funny, people will ask questions, but how often does someone strike a conversation about your research in the grocery store? And I would say with this sort of stuff, that happens routinely. And I, on Instagram, went ahead and kind of asked, just open, the conversation, because I know a lot of people who wear this stuff, like what does it do? And why do people think that maybe it's an effective way to communicate science? And a lot of it was sparking conversations with people, and having people deem them as being approachable. Generally, I think scientists were seen as kind of being a real stuffy kind of group of people that are unapproachable. But, if you're wearing, beetles on your shirt or something like that, it kind of gives you the appearance of wanting to communicate, I think. And, even fosters some kind of fun environment in the classroom. It's funny that, to tell you the truth, my students never say anything to me about the way I dress, which is funny, but they tell other faculty who then tell me that they really like it. So it's not cool to talk to the professor about what she wears. However, I hear the rumors circulating, which is fun. And I like the thing to say, though, that this Carrie actually says it allows me to lean into my humanity and connect with people. And again, I think that since science isn't generally a self-expressive activity, you're not expressing your own personality within your science necessarily, but the way that we dress, you can, and it gives you that opportunity, which then I think it humanizes you and makes you a little more approachable, which I think can be a good thing, for a lot of us in the sciences. But I wanted to have a lot of opportunity for conversation tonight, so I didn't keep this going too long. Let's see. But I did want to show you one of my, so this is kind of what I was working on. It's just a little beaded, I think it's going to end up being a brooch. The back side is just some little felt bits, and the top side is just a bunch of little beads. I found a cool little tutorial on Instagram, and I was like, I have beads. And so I kind of worked on this last night, but a few years ago, Jess saw me when I gave a talk on, I'm really into insects and fashion. And I gave a talk on kind of insects and in modern fashion, like high fashion. And Alexander McQueen is one of my favorite designers. He uses a lot of insects, and he had a whole gown covered in little beetles like this. And while I don't think I have enough time to make an entire ball gown encrusted in these guys, I know I'm going to make something with these all over it at some point. So that's what you'll see me in next time I come to ESA, Jess, is a dress covered in these.
Oh my gosh, I can't wait. It's gonna be amazing. Well, awesome. Thank you so much. Yeah, does anyone have any questions right off the bat or things to say? I will say I recently wore my science this weekend to a music event where I wore I made them out of wire, mandibles like this, little antenna, as a headband. And it was totally what you're saying. Everyone was like, are those what is that? And then I'd talk about ants.
That is fantastic. I might need a picture of that, Jess.
Yes, I'll send it to you.
Me too, yeah.
Cool. I know someone asked a very specific question earlier. They were asking about the fabric markers. Do you know what fabric markers were used in that one?
I think I actually specifically asked her that, and she was like, oh, just something they had at Joann's, really vague. So I don't. And I know Sharpie specifically has fabric markers. So Sharpie brand fabric markers, and I've used those, and they're pretty good. So I think that there's a plethora of varieties, and sometimes it just takes a while. And sometimes I think it's the fabric that you're using, to actually, it's going to take to different brands of markers better than others. Did you see that Jennifer Angus's talk when you were at ESA, Jess? She's the gal that does all the pinned insects that look like wallpaper.
No, but I've seen wallpaper like that. Not anyone behind the making of it.
Anyway, I'm going to go up for spring break and we're going to screen print like giant insect prints together. So we'll see.
So
I'm
cool.
I'm super excited. So, because she apparently makes these big like sheets of screen printed fabric, and I asked her, what do you do with those? And she's like, oh, nothing. I just put them on my shelf. And I'm like, I will sew you something. So
Oh, I can't wait to see what you make. Does anyone else have anything to ask or comment? Just unmute.
I didn't see your comments as they were coming in. I just am now. So thank you very much. But a lot of this, I know it can be like, I'll admit that me being like, look, I just whipped this out last night. I mean, I have been doing some form of textile art since I was like a real little kid. Like, I think when I was like 5, my grandma gave me like an embroidery kit. So, and then I proceeded to knot the whole thing up and it was a disaster. And the first time I picked up knitting, it was a disaster. So I think you do develop some kind of muscle memory. So you got to give yourself a little bit of a break. Start simple, especially with this embroidery. I like the example where she just did like the stars and stuff on her butt. Because it was kind of crude, and you can just take like chalk pens or washable pens, draw what you want, fix it. And then it really is just like doing an outline with fabric. Like James's comment, like got exposed to a whole world. And, you know, I mean, to be fair, I think if some of us didn't have like grandmothers, and like I did 4-H and I grew up in the country and everybody learned to knit. And I think there's also, I was talking to somebody about this and I thought it was really interesting. So my mom sews and does stuff, but I think that there's like generational gaps sometimes. And I think often there's a resurgence of sewing and mending in this generation that our parents were liberated from, right? Like, we can enjoy it because we don't have to do it. Where my grandmother, she had some creative elements in it, but I kind of think that maybe there's a resurgence to some of these things because it's not something that I'm being forced to do, you know? So I think that there's all these interesting interplays of feminism and all sorts of cool stuff happening with some of this art. So I'm interested to explore more of that. I'm really just kind of on the cusp of exploring it. So yeah,
I just wanted to say,
go ahead.
I have a lot of like embroidery supplies. So if anybody's interested, I can bring stuff on Thursday. Like I have some spare hoops, I have lots of floss, I have needles, and I've been working on a hat. It's in its infancy. The stitch markers are bigger than the hat itself, but I'm trying.
That's all it takes is a little bit of an attempt, right? Like, that's great. Embroidery party.
Yes, thank you, Claire.
This is so cool. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this talk. I had like one very specific question is, could you show the slide with the person, the paleontologist who was doing stuff again? I didn't quite catch their name.
Yeah, let me share that with you real quick.
Not the turtle guy, the other person.
Yeah, I know who you're talking about. And I did reach out to her, but let's see, did I share the right screen? I feel like
that's it. That's exactly what I was looking.
So let me move it over here. It's Emily Keeble. It's Flower Period Patches. And I haven't heard back from them yet, but some people don't necessarily check their Instagram constantly. But I was just kind of curious what their thoughts were and what their experiences were.
Yeah, that shirt is so awesome, showing the Cambrian explosion, the evolution.
Oh, I know, right? Like that would be, I thought that one was really amazing. And that's just it, that some of this, I think I got more inspiration as I kind of looked for people, like-minded people. And I could see it would be interesting to do like, you know, a collaborative thing at ESA someday if there were a lot of people who were kind of into, I don't know, making their own fashion statements. I know there are a lot of us that do this sort of thing, because while you can find, I'll admit I am somewhat biased against wearing butterflies because you can find them too much, right? Like there's nothing really that novel about wearing butterflies, but if I can find beetles, it's great. But now I'm like, oh, I really want to make something like Dobson flies or earwigs, because everyone kind of, you know, the ones that are less, you know, I've never seen a shirt that features an earwig, right? Like, Why
yeah,
not?
yeah, it like turns it from like aesthetic to educational kind of. Well, I mean, it's obviously both, but it's like people will ask you about an earwig, not a butterfly as much.
They'll just assume I'm just some normal person on the street wearing butterflies, but
Exactly.
an
And
earwig.
then
Mhm.
but I had a second question, which is like, could you talk a little bit more about like conversations you've had like from wearing this? Like how has like share some examples of like how this is like wearing stuff has been able to like allow you to share science with people and how is it different in like a professional context, like at a conference versus like you're at the grocery store?
I mean, at the grocery store, a lot of times it's, hey, I like your sweater, or did you knit that? Or, do you really you must really like bugs. I get that one. Like just some person will be like, wow, like what's wrong? It's almost like a what's wrong with you? But then if you open the conversation of, oh, I'm an entomologist, often it's so cute because oftentimes if they're there with their kids, like suddenly you become a celebrity, right? Like, oh, talk to her, she's an entomologist. My husband, who's a data analytics person, is like, no one ever brings their children over to meet me. But as entomologists, we get kind of rock star status because kids get it. But a lot of times it'll be that sort of thing where they wouldn't have talked to me and their kid wouldn't have had the opportunity to meet an entomologist, which suddenly makes me a real person, which makes me a real career opportunity for these people. You know what I mean? It makes all those links, I think. In a professional standpoint, I think back think back to my early professional meetings, and the tone has really shifted. You didn't see anybody, I've got my blue hair streaks in. You didn't see that like at early meetings I went to. Everyone was wearing like suits. Everyone was, and once in a while you'd see like a tie, or the women would wear a brooch. So I think that's really shifted. And I think there's definitely more of a mentality of celebration of diversity, celebration of who we are, and kind of that sort of, you know what I mean? I feel like the conferences have become more celebratory, and I think the way people dress is part of that. And I think that's a good thing. So, but yeah, it's a lot of that. I have conversations with people that I wouldn't have otherwise. And I think that, well, my students are too cool to talk to me about my fashion. I don't know why, they're just funny. I do think it makes me more approachable, and I have really good relationships with my students. So it is kind of a funny thing though. It's like the unsaid, the elephant in the room that nobody talks about. It's funny.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah.
If no one else has a question, I have one. You kind of touched on the this whole like concept of like being accurate versus like I guess less accurate or like being more free. Like I think about that a lot with like science art, and especially in the context of science communication. Like how much do you feel like you could kind of like steer away from being like perfectly accurate in your representation of stuff? Like, yeah, where is your stance on that?
I think as long as you've got like the basics down, right? Like I'm never doing anything that has like the wrong number of legs. But because I feel like there's a few things that I like, if you're an artist, I will give you like complete, like I'm never going around judging people's artistic representations of anything. But as an entomologist, I feel like as a scientist, I still have to get, you're right. We can't misrepresent the data. We can't misrepresent it. But I think as long as the message and the organism is still embodies what it was meant to be, if the wings are a little too big, or you've done some sort of really cool, like almost watercolor representation of something, I think you're fine. I think it's as long as the facts are still there, but you can be impressionistic with it. And sometimes I think sometimes if it's like a staunch scientific illustration where that's beautiful, it's maybe not as, approachable for some people. But I think, and the thing is everyone's going to be different. Some of us couldn't bring ourselves to be a little more whimsical, where some of us can, because we're just more whimsical in terms of our personalities, right? And that should come through.
So true. Thank you. Any other questions or comments, concerns? Anything?
Love it. I know that Barrett Klein was very praised this group of students very highly. So he thought a lot of all of you, because I was getting those pictures from him, like, oh, I'm going to talk to Jess's group tonight. And he's like, oh, they're great. Absolutely
Yeah.
wonderful.
Yes, yeah, Barrett stayed and kind of like talked about project ideas with everyone. So yeah, maybe
Very nice.
yeah. Yeah, and it's your examples were perfect because we have like paleontologists here. We have literally someone who studies trilobites. And
Oh,
like,
really?
yeah. So it was really great. A lot of botany people too. So honestly, spot on.
Good, good. I wasn't sure what I'm sorry, there were a lot of insect references, but I can't help myself. But
Yeah, we
yeah.
got a lot of those too.
Oh, I did want to show you, this was a quick embroidery project. So I just took the elytra and they are just tacked on there with a little bit of embroidery thread. But it's a dicky, you know, like the thing you stick underneath your t-shirt. But that way I only have to wash this much. But right there, you've got yourself. This is a little eccentric. I showed this
cool.
to my dad and he about lost it. He's like,
I love it.
great. Yeah, I just wear it underneath of like a t-shirt or something and let that stick out underneath the blazer. It's perfect.
So cool. I didn't even know that was a thing.
Yeah. And the nice thing is what I thought too is I could do some embroidery just here on the collar. And then you could wear it underneath the things. And that way, if you did a really fine, I've seen other people do this where if you do a really fine scale embroidery that you don't want to like constantly have to wash, but having things like just little collars that stick out is a nicer way, you know, so that way, you have to think about the washability. I mean, people ask about this jacket all the time. They're like, how do you wash it? And I'm like, almost never, but you can, but hand wash it very carefully, you know?
Yeah, the things you have to think about when your art like is also like has utility, you know?
Yeah, and that's the thing that you do have to kind of like, I spend time on this stuff, but not the amount of time that I would probably put into like a painting I'm putting on my wall, because ultimately this is meant to be used. And I have the mentality of if it gets busted at some point, at least, you know, I got to wear it and got to kind of share. I always wear the elytra jacket when I'm talking about structural coloration for entomology. And that really takes home the point of how strong beetle shells are, how they actually operate, you know, so it's, you know, I wear the jewelry too, so it's fun.
Yeah, so
Oh,
cool.
I like the idea of a dissertation defense outfit. I highly recommend. Got to get started on that. Not like you don't have enough going on.
When you knit, do you use acrylics then, or do you stick with natural fibers?
I tend to stick with natural fibers. I think a different, the ones with the lettering and stuff, I tend to use a real like, I'd almost say a scratchy wool, because it's a little more forgiving. It sticks in that way. The tension, if it's a little off, it kind of almost felts itself. But I'll admit, like the acrylics and stuff are cheaper. And if you're just starting out, I totally get using that stuff. But then once you start using kind of the natural fibers, it's really hard to kind of go back to using the acrylics, at least in my experience. One project, I thought I had my sketchbook here, but I'm not sure where I go. I'm actually working on my next project. I'm planning on using silk yarn with some wool, because I don't think it could be 100% silk, and dyeing it with insect dyes, so lac, cochineal, and gall, and then actually trying to incorporate the motif of those insects in the, you know what I mean? Like it'd be very meta. Knit with insects, of insects, dyed within, you know, it's just the whole thing to kind of really celebrate like the breadth of the textile industry within entomology. But that one's kind of crazy, so we'll see.
Oh, that's the best, and the form matches the content, you know.
Yeah, that's my next. I've been collecting the stuff, and we did do my entomology class. We, you know, this is a sheet made of full. The whole thing is made out of. You can't see it really, but it's like crushed silk moth cocoons. So the whole cocoon is there, they're sewn together. And then we use like different insect dyes to actually dye it. It's a bookmark. And then they've got a little tassel. That's the little buprestid beetle wings. So that was my Insects in Society art project. They all got to walk away. And then we made, and this isn't textile art, but then we made Valentines. And we made the heart and did a big blob of watercolor paint. And then we dropped some live maggots on there, and then they squirmed off the page.
Oh, so cool.
It's a collaborative art project with maggots and students. So
I want to be
All
your student. Oh my God.
all of my my colleagues in the biology department got one of these for Valentine's Day. I don't know that they all appreciated it, but I keep them on their toes.
Oh my God, that's so cool. Yeah, Hannah, she had to go early, but she does a lot of maggot art too. So yes, that is always super fun. Okay, well, I guess it's 6 o'clock now, so we should let you go, especially since what time is it there? 9 or like
8.
8?
It's only
8. Oh, okay.
fine.
Okay. Only 8. Well, let's all thank Tierney again for being here. We're all super inspired clearly from the chat, and